Hi, and welcome to the fifth in our series on the European Union and its legal organization. I'm here with my host, Aaron Reyes, and one of the things that I'd like to do before we get started is go through the rules. This is not an academic presentation. Neither Aaron nor I are accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing today, aside from the fact that I have a disused master's in the business law of the European Union. That said, this is not an academic presentation, and we're providing this as lay people. This is going to be a secular presentation. And let's be respectful, despite the fact that these topics might not be as contentious as some of the stuff that I do in other fora. They are still worthy of respect and gentility. That said, we love interactivity. Please put your questions, comments, clarifications in the chat. We do read the chat, and I will read those questions from time to time for myself and Aaron to respond to. This session will be a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, we'll catch you up. And if you already knew something, we'll probably tell you something you didn't know. We have a 2-hour hard stop, so so within the next 2 hours, if we don't get to all the slides that we want to get to, which is a high probability, we will stop there and continue on next time. And this is also a recording, like all the other ones in this European Union series. You can come back and watch it later. And so last time we had talked about the French election and how it really was a referendum on returning to normalcy in European Union politics. And then we talked about the history of the EU formation, that it was created through a number of gradual steps, starting with the European Coal and Steel Community in 1952, and then the treaties of Rome and Euratom in 1957. We also talked about how that union was brought together as well by a monetary union. And we discussed most of this in detail in the first session, and as well as the Treaty of Lisbon, which may well come into discussions today concerning the defense formation of the European Union. We also talked about how the European organizations are multifaceted layered. Not every European Union member is a member of every European organization, and there are European members of different European organizations that are also not members of the EU. So there's a lot of volatility within the membership style of any particular country. And this makes clear just how complex the European Union umbrella is. And we're getting to that part within the EU blue bloc, but it hasn't quite been subsumed under the Treaty of Lisbon, which is that end arrow on the right-hand side.
And that's so which makes it all easier.
In theory.
It's okay.
And so EU governance sort of branches out into a legislative, judicial, and executive. But the key point to take away from the EU is that it's more than an international organization, less than a state. It has multi-level governance, devolving powers to the states as much as possible, and its legitimacy is precarious because even though it's united by a number of democratic states, with the exception of one of the legislative branches, it does not actually have democratic mechanisms that are directly voted on by the citizenry. And we talked about what these core institutions are, right? The overarching institutions that sort of plan and organize what laws will be passed, then the legislative, executive, and judiciary, which go through them. And we discussed that a lot in episode 2 in this series. Then we talked about the legal attribute of direct applicability, where unlike other international instruments, EU law is directly applicable without a national measure, unlike other international institutions. And we talked about how those competences are broken apart between the different European entities, whether it's an exclusive competence of the EU, whether it's a competence that EU shares with the member states, and whether it's something that the states do without EU interference. We then started narrowing our focus in the fourth discussion to our common foreign and security policies. And we talked about how increasingly in the economic, social, legal, and international relations security realms, more and more was devolved to the European Union, and you can see that from the graph here. We also talked about how the threat from the Soviet Union and the wider defense of Europe led to the creation of the the European Defense Community, to protect West European security, in order to not fully rely on NATO as well. We then talked about whether or not the Western European Union, which was a formation of the EDC, how it should expand and work throughout the 1950s, and how the French were opposed to an expansion that included Britain in that calculation. They saw the continent as being distinct from British policy in the long term. We also saw that the Europeans began to cooperate politically and started working together in The Hague in order to do that. So you would have these meetings of government ministers, foreign ministers, in order to create political action committees, and this would operate in parallel to the EC, or the European communities, that was happening on the economic side and that we addressed in the first discussion. We then saw how the end of the Cold War would then affect the Western European Union and give new dimensions to the European Union and European communities to security and defense, and that it would proceed independently from that of the United States in a greater degree, since the threat was not as overarching and the European Union could plot its own course. And one of the last things we really talked about was how the EU really dealt with the Gulf crisis. And while they did fight within alongside the American-led coalition, they fought as independent countries, each bringing about their own concerns about fighting or not fighting, as the case may be. And so Europe was beginning to take a new military policy that was distinct from the NATO policy that had predominated during the Cold Wars. And of course, this is highlighted in the divide between Britain and the rest of the continent, where Britain has a more Atlanticist view, Portugal as well takes a more Atlanticist view in the Netherlands, and those views bring the United States and Canada further into the European defensive organization, and the Europeanists, primarily led by France and Germany, are seeking to create a European-based defensive organization as we move into the 90s. Aaron?
Yeah, no, great. So, you know, you could argue that there's been these catalytic events basically every decade in the history of in the post Cold War history of European defense, and its frictions that it has. The Gulf War and the Bosnian War in the 90s were the major events, and the Bosnian War basically showed how the large actors like Germany, France, will basically have entrepreneurial policy and not, in essence, align themselves, or only align themselves once those policies reached conclusion. So an example being Germany's, I would say, pretty premature recognition of Croatia, while Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, was had an enormous instability, and the actors were attempting to declare their independence. Germany just basically randomly on a Wednesday, declaring full recognition of Croatia as a state without telling anybody, really, UN, NATO, the rest of the European partners, the rest of the Yugoslavian partners, Russia, anybody. And so I'm not going to suggest that that was the trigger for the conflict. It's not, but it didn't help. Let's put it that way.
Now, why would Germany take such a unilateral move when we've been discussing how a lot of these groups have been sort of forming together, especially in the wake of US withdrawal from Europe?
Sure. So there is this very unique approach to foreign policy, international affairs, and defense and military and security that European states have, which is starting to form itself, really, to be honest, in the United States the last 20 years, which is when parties or coalition governments change, those policies change pretty substantially. And when you have a shift in let's say, political philosophy, which in Germany around human rights and around independence and around, let's say, the idea of any form of emancipation occurs, Germany will sort of lead with the heart, if that's a sort of a fair way to put it. And I'm not trying to suggest this is a bad thing in sort of principle, but when you're looking at let's say at a contagion event, which, let's be honest, that was what really the former Yugoslavia was, you needed arguably really strong actors all over the place to try to maintain as much stability and not allow independent sub-states or states or actors within former Yugoslavia to basically escalate and amplify that conflict. And that was pretty well accepted all the way back to even the Gulf War period, 1990, 89, 90, 91. Germany basically, in general, feels like it can have its own independent foreign and international policy when it feels like it, and then it wants to force adherence by everybody when it feels like it. And you see that, you even see that play out in Ukraine the last decade plus. You saw it play out in Afghanistan and Iraq. I would say they were probably closer to being on the right side of the Iraq one. But on the Afghanistan one, they sort of hem and hawed until they kind of went all in the way they want to go all in. And then they sort of pull back when they want to pull back, and then they go all in again. And a lot of this comes down to really the structure of their social democracy, and that they've never really reconciled themselves as a large state actor on the global stage from a defense and security standpoint. And their constitution doesn't reflect that. The political parties manifestos don't reflect that. The whole defense and security establishment is really almost a cognitive dissonance, because they're one of the large, important, and probably one of the best defense manufacturers in the world, most of which they don't buy their own material. So, it's really strange, where the Israelis or the Norwegians or, dozens of states around the world will buy some of the best, German, defense products that exist, except the German defense won't buy most of it. So so they really live in this very, and I do think what's going on in Ukraine is maybe, I do put a maybe in this, shaking that foundation to some degree. I don't think it's as substantial as people believe, because the population has not shifted has not made as large of a shift to support a proactive defense and military state policy in Germany. And if they don't, the German political parties will reflect that. It doesn't matter, which then leads you down this cycle again, where they sort of cherry pick missions or cherry pick policies that fit a particular moment of politics in Germany.
So if we're looking at the Bosnian War, right, the EU really can't solve this international crisis. Is it that the EU didn't know how to put boots on the ground? Is that they didn't know how to coordinate with each other? Like, walk through.
So that's a great question. So I think it's easy to get to the boots on the ground piece as the last piece first. I would say fundamentally, they didn't have any type of mechanisms between each other to really force a heavy duty conference that could radically create the deterrence by the actor, for those actors, right? They did not have the ability to early on construct basically a permanent crisis working committee. And you see this with almost everything. I mean, you had COVID the last 2 years, one of the larger challenges in the world, and they didn't really have a permanent working committee. However haphazard and goofy the one in the US was, or Japan or other countries, there's sort of an acceptance that if a substantial global crisis is going on, or a regional one, you're gonna, and it's got long runways, then you're going to construct instruments and structures to try to deal with it. And so really that never happened. It was ad hoc. And of course, that allowed all the actors to sort of cherry pick the ad hoc members. And it wasn't really till NATO, arguably took over the complete dimension of security for Bosnia and for dealing with the crisis, which took, till it was completed, roughly 9 years, 8 years. So, and it was really still going on through the 2000s and 2010s with the different security missions into Kosovo and into training missions, into bringing the members into, the EU and into NATO. I know Mark has his hand up, so.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and just to make sure I'm on the same page, the question was why the EU didn't intervene militarily in Bosnia, right?
Oh, no, not necessarily militarily. I mean, just from I would say, leadership standpoint, in not allowing its member states to, or its early member states to roguely construct a policy while a civil war was
in its vicinity,
in essence, breaking out. Yeah, exactly. And then expanding and amplifying. And I would argue they would have, this sort of proves the point. It's like the double negative concept, right? In logic, right? If everyone remembers, I don't know if people are really old enough, but if they remember, there was a big conversation of this war expanding into Macedonia back then. And that was this sort of artificial red line, right? Everybody knew, like, oh, well, we're going to get really serious if that happens. And I always thought, well, why don't you get serious if that doesn't happen? So they basically accepted a containment of a civil war and said, oh, well, I mean, they really kind of took on almost a UN dimension, which is, like in the soft sense of the UN, not necessarily in the post-conflict management sense. So that's how I interpreted the question. I don't know if that was your intention, Richard.
No, my intention, I guess, was sort of more from the perspective of, you've got this, what is in theory supposed to be a regional power, right? You've got the European Union, and it's backed by this Western European Union as a military organization, and you've got some of the most powerful states in the world combined that have a historic nature of patrolling their empires and controlling large swaths of territory. Now we've got a conflict that is within a 1-hour flight of the capitals, right, of several of these countries. You wouldn't see this kind of behavior if war broke out in Myanmar from China. You wouldn't see this kind of behavior if something happened in Tajikistan vis-a-vis Russia, right? Those countries actually maintain their spheres of influence and are much less potent in theory than the European Union. So the question really is, why at this point is it the United States that's really demonstrating the ability to project power in the European context and not the EU? And so that I felt like you and Mark both sort of addressed different aspects of that.
Yeah, I was going for why they didn't reject or project power was they needed to do everything when they could only do something if everybody agreed to do that exact same thing. And for every country, they each had a different foreign policy take on the Yugoslavian civil war, so no one agreed on anything.
Well, but so this is my dirty argument to the whole concept, is that these are the same states, most of which were NATO members, that then agreed once the US projected the necessary strategic and tactical power into the region, which I would argue pretty substantially escalated, actually, the conflict. I mean, there was really at that point, I don't think, any choice. So part of my argument has always been that the European states play this game with all the institutionality that they've created. So they basically have they've created an instrumentation of, and we'll show some of all these institutions, and it allows them to play, aw shucks, can't do anything here because we don't have an agreement. But then when there's a requisite outside party like the United States, or maybe one of the 2 or 3 big superpowers in Europe, France, UK, from a NATO standpoint, that are willing to lead missions or in essence put skin in the game, then they'll tag along. At least I would argue the interior European states have tended to do that. I think the culture is changing in the last 10, 20 years, because as you bring in all the Eastern states and now obviously Nordic and Baltic states, they have a much more, I would say, aggressive mindset, because I think they've been a lot closer to a lot of these conflicts. The Bosnian one's a weird one because everyone was close to it. I would argue that at some level, and this is something that you're seeing in the ascension of the former Yugoslavia states, that the Balkans has never really been respected by European states as European. I think there is almost a, I'm not going to, well, maybe I'm not going to stretch it all the way out and suggest at a sort of a racial or national view of people as lesser or more.
But I think your point is well taken, that there's something Middle Eastern seeming from the European perspective about the Balkans. Now, I have a question in the comments saying that Yugoslavia was a complex country with numerous different ethnic groups that had fought with each other for centuries. In fact, me personally, I'm covering that next week, some of that centuries-old fighting. Come see me Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. But anyway, so Tito contained it through force and through a very organized communist party.
Yep.
Could the EU use some kind of economic influence, military influence, some other kind of influence to keep the Yugoslav states together, without going to the NATO option?
I mean, my belief is that I think the actions of the Germans and the French and the Italians were almost a legacy, not quite imperialistic, but I would almost call it liberal imperialistic, if that makes any sense to anybody. And then you mixed it with their sort of entrepreneurialism. And then they just sort of backed away and said, "Oh shucks, it's a human catastrophe, human rights. Someone should do something about it. Let's go to the UN for 5 years." That they really advocated their leadership. And they never really accounted for it. I mean, it's one of the interesting things in the European security, foreign policy, defense world. They just sort of keep chugging away, going forward. They don't sort of. They might do sort of after action at a tactical operational level, but they don't really square themselves with, okay, as this collective power. What do we do right? What do we do wrong? What won't we try to do next time? They never accounted for that. And I would argue, in a strange way, Ukraine is a strange do-over, which they didn't account for very well with Crimea and with other hostile actions that occurred in Ukraine going back really to 2004. Georgia's the same way, which we'll go over. So I would argue that's the operational tendency they have. And I don't see any mechanism that's going to change this. You're not going to get an abdication of strategic power to the EU by the largest states. France is not giving up their strategic capacity. If anything, they're going to reinforce it. The UK being out of the EU, I would say, simplifies it and makes it even less capable at the same time. I think that's the biggest. I think fundamentally the Europeans liked having the UK around because it was an interesting punching bag, and the UK obviously made it easy to be a punching bag at the same time when it came to some of the policy decisions. But in the end, I think you would have had a much stronger European security and defense with the UK in. It's one of the misses that Germany's had for really 40, 50 years, and not really fighting to have the UK in the EU, even as the UK at times has fought not to be in the EU. But there's that dimension there, and the French haven't helped either. So there is this sort of age old, 1648 legacy of Peace of Westphalia kind of subculture that is still there, and the vestiges are still there. And I think Bosnia really was the key to that.
All right, so can we start to discuss a little bit about
Sure.
the Peace Declaration? What was that, and
Absolutely.
how did that change things?
Yeah, so I think it becomes hopefully clear to everybody that there's these this constant attempt to construct some type of European Union security structure, and so the Petersburg Declaration was really about constructing the complete structure of the West European Union's defense, or what the boundaries of that would be, which is humanitarian rescue missions, peacekeeping, crisis management, and peacemaking. And then the key to this is that the goal was to be supportive of NATO and not in conflict with NATO. So it was really, I would argue, the attempt to sort of create the UN dimension to NATO, but for European security, which of course fit the milieu of what the majority of European states wanted their security and foreign policy to be, which was a more social democratic, humanitarian centric, human rights centric foreign policy and security structure. And then when there's these ugly situations, then the traditional defense and foreign policy institutions sort of take those ones on. That was sort of left unsaid, but that basically is what the consideration was. And realize this occurred in the context, for those of you that either read about it or old enough, of the concept of the peace dividend, which was the end of the Cold War. So this belief, the end of history, this belief that we were going to be in this, neoliberal trade-centric world where we have more peace, which I think is mostly true, except the fact that you do get, disruptive actors at various stages, and you can't shut down. You can't, as my friend says, you can't defund the defense, right? It's the same sort of principle there, right? You have to have enough that it offers a deterrence. Well, and that's sort of the concept here, is that there's a whole construct of belief in some European quarters around the fact that concepts like deterrence were legacy. They were artifacts of the Cold War, that in a new world, things like deterrence, things like force, were really legacy manifestations of old power politics. And that there should be a new world built on compromise, cooperation, comity, people working together. And I think amongst states that do that, that's all true. I think amongst states that don't, that's where the rub is. Do you want to go to the next slide? And so what we have to recognize is that the CFSP was constructed in that foundation of Maastricht, post-Cold War, peace dividend. Even though we have this sort of thing going on in the Balkans, let's sort of forget about it Monday to Thursday while we're in, Strasbourg or in Brussels, which, to be blunt, when you go back and look at it, is literally what they did, which is one of the strangest things, is to just go back and read some of these press conferences where the first part of the press conference is talking about this. They leave for 5 minutes, they come back, and then they have a new press conference talking about the Balkans. Same people. I mean, it's strange. I've always felt that was pretty strange. You almost have not quite the same thing anymore, thank goodness, but there is a version of that still exists, and you see with Ukraine, where you have this ability for Europe to be working on its institutional framework, independent of facts on the ground, which I do give them credit for, the ability to construct these instruments and these frameworks and these treaties, because, you know, arguably it's the largest collaborative, cooperative, multi-state treaty system in human history that's stuck and is expanding. So, you know, it is it's deserving of its grandeur, but there still is ground truth going on, and especially where there's historically dangerous events like in Ukraine or in Bosnia, or the migration crisis, or in Afghanistan, or, you know, whatever, that this instrumentation really isn't built for, and they've never really constructed, let's say, the harder power sort of instrumentation. I think this what's going on in Ukraine is going to be the bellwether, because if they don't construct any kind of hard power instrumentation for that, then they never will. I just don't think they will. Well, it just, because what would you need? An invasion of Italy? I mean, like there's nothing else left, right? You're pretty close. So if you don't, if one of the big three powers on earth is breaching, Europe, and that doesn't give you the instrumentation, then I just don't think, then really what's going to happen is this folds under the hard power of NATO. And NATO becomes what it always was, which is the European, defense and deterrence alliance. And then that gets reinforced. And then they have to, I'll be honest with you, they'll have a big challenge, because they've instrumented a lot of stuff in the last 20 years, things that aren't really that cool, but that matter, like procurement and assignments and sharing of information, that they don't work with NATO on, that most states still have these sort of these very hard high walls, and they're gonna have to bring all those down if that's what the real shift is over the next I'd say 3 to 5 years. So I do think there's a watershed moment in their security, just like this was when they constructed the CFSP, because they never had this. So having something was better than nothing. And this was their way of constructing what's called joint action. So you'll hear, even to this day, these sort of joint action press releases. That sounds like a corporate thing that doesn't mean anything between two partnered companies. But in reality, this is a pretty important commitment, let's say, by European Council decision makers. This is probably the closest thing to their hard power, is a joint action from the Council, which is all established here in 91, 92. Next slide. Yeah, so they created, and this is going to be interesting here, because we're going to talk about Ukraine next week, but at least when it comes to European pieces, I think a lot of people have heard in the last week that Ukraine is going to apply, or be allowed to apply, or has applied and will be considered in their application for associate membership. So this is, the instrumentation, in essence, behind this. So it's not just some words. I mean, it's legal, it's piles of paper, it's a fantastic jobs program for lawyers in the EU, basically. You know, and what's going to be fascinating is we're going to see this association membership play out publicly. I mean, not that these other membership applications weren't public in the past, but they were sort of behind, let's call it press release gibberish. This one, I mean, the way the Ukrainians roll, number one, is they definitely update grades on Twitter real time. So it's going to be interesting to see them and the Europeans. And the Europeans, and let's be honest about this, the EU is a pretty opaque set of institutions by design. It's part of the legitimacy challenges democratically. And I think Ukraine's going to challenge a lot of the, let's say, internal conflicts, because they've done that already. And there's a ton of these internal conflicts, which the EU has been able to basically tell member or associate application states, tough, deal with it. You know, you want in? Yes, I know I'm making you fill out 3 documents all in conflict with each other. You know, hire more lawyers, you know, and I know I'm being a little cynical about that, but I don't think I'm being too inaccurate, actually. And I think this is going to be this watershed moment where I think Ukraine, every time they run into a speed bump, they're going to bring out 10 of these, let's say, in conflict requests from the EU, or bureaucratic latency and that they have, which they have more than enough of it. So I think this will be pretty fascinating. I would recommend people follow this, because I think this is going to put a lot of pressure on a lot of institutional actors in the EU who are not used to having pressure in the bureaucratic, you know, inside the bureaucracy. They're pretty walled off. And I think, and they're used to basically it being a one-way street, you know, and you've already seen some of this with Poland and Hungary and other states. I think those cases are a lot weaker. I think Ukraine's going to be more interesting, though, because when maybe there's a change in agriculture regulations, which were designed basically by the French, and the Ukrainians are going to challenge that, probably because it'll make sense to challenge it, like, rationally. You're going to start to see this play out, because obviously the majority of people who are in the EU bureaucracy in agriculture are French, so it's not an accident, and a good chunk are Italian and from Belgium. But there's not a lot from the Czech Republic, right? There's not a lot from Poland, let's say, and Ukraine is a agricultural superpower, obviously. So they deserve, I would argue, an equal seat to the French. I don't think that's unfair. So anyways, I just think this will be a very interesting thing. And where this gets very interesting is on the defense side. I believe, actually, my daughter asked me this question last night out of left field. She's not an EU nerd like any of us. She asked, well, you know, is with Ukraine's application, are they, is it now 1 inch in the EU? And I said, well, no, it's not going to probably work that way. It's, you know, they're going to go really slow on the defense pieces, probably 5 years from now. But it was a good question. I hadn't thought about that. So
there's actually a similar question we have in the comments. Yeah. So one of the assumptions underlying
so the regular real people are right about this one.
Yeah. No, the assumption was that, of course, in order to enter the EU, what Ukraine would have to do would be to clamp down on its corruption, clamp down on the oligarchs, create a more standardized democratic system, all of these pieces. Do you feel that Ukraine will be held up to the Copenhagen criteria like all the other countries have been?
Yeah. I think they will. And by the way, I think I would tell anybody now, we underestimate Ukraine's commitment at our peril. to anything at this point. I mean, at this point, I'm giving them the benefit. If they're like, we want a space program, I'm like, they'll figure a way to get Elon Musk to launch SpaceX from there. I mean, they are acting like a true rising regional power right now, even though, their country's being obliterated, which makes it even more remarkable. So I actually think their legal and judicial commitments are going to be pretty substantial. Now, I will say that will square against the kind of post-conflict development they're going to have to go through, which is going to be a feeding of the trough, right? Because obviously the amount of I would argue the amount of development they're going to need is probably about $1 trillion, right? It's going to be probably, because of the modern world, right? Everything just costs a lot more money, and people want more advanced living. So you're going to have a lot of actors in there, mostly European ones. So that's where it's going to get tricky, right? Is that the legal judicial system I think they'll make most of those reforms, if not all of them. But the on the ground deal making in a place that is, when you're talking about, by the end, probably tens of thousands of towns and villages that have to be rebuilt, plus all the, mainline infrastructure underneath it all. You're going to have, I would say, the same graph challenges you'd have anywhere in the world if you had that happen. If an asteroid hit Germany, and not that I'd want that to happen, but and it required trillions in redevelopment. Or Kobe. Look at Kobe when the earthquake happened, right? It was the same thing. Japan's as industrialized and advanced as any place in the world ever, and you still had lots of those challenges. So I think that's going to be, but we all know how that's going to work out, right? So as long as Europeans doing it to Europeans, EU Europeans, I'm saying, they'll figure that one out.
Now, sort of a corollary question to that is, if either the European Union does expedite them, as you suggested that they wouldn't, but if they did, or if the European Union looks at what you suggest will happen, which are these massive institutional changes in Ukraine that will lead the EU to make positive statements towards Ukraine, how does this affect the Western European group in terms of holding together and its relationship with Russia? Because that could antagonize that.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I still think there's this massive split we're in right now that we've been in really since the end of the Cold War, which is that the French and the Germans, for the most part, the Italians, don't forget them, have a unique historical and political, and I would say realpolitik modern relationship with Russia, and a version of one with China, but especially Russia. And the Eastern European and Central European and Baltic and Nordic countries have literally the exact opposite relationship, except for, a few exceptions, or at least parts of a few countries. I don't think all of Hungary, I don't think all of Serbia, I don't think all of these places have 100% relationship supportive of Russia. I think it's whether it's a majority, it might be, but it's not 100%.
It's a politically controversial question across
exactly. And so, whereas you have the new Europe, let's call it new Europe, not in sort of in the Rumsfeld way, but I'd say a 2022 twist on it with Ukraine. I think the new Europe is going to be challenging those French and German relationships. To be honest, I am surprised at how substantial the commitment to disconnect Russia is from the UK. They've really, for a large state, they're the only large state, that's of the United States, that's really shown, to do this. Canada, I would say to some degree too, but
harder for them to do it.
Yeah, exactly. But given the interest that Russia or Russians, let's say, and proxies had in the UK, how substantial it was. And it was substantial. Probably on the order of at least hundreds of billions, if not nearly $1 trillion or more. arguably more than even France or Germany or Italy had. I mean, maybe Germany, because of energy, is larger, but I mean, they went all in, and the Germans and French and the Italians just are unable to do this. And I would argue, if you can't do it now, you're not going to do it the closer you get to either a conclusion of the conflict or some type of peace treaty. You're only going to go back the other way. And so I think that puts them in permanent conflict with New Europe, basically. And I do think this is pretty substantial, because New Europe is arming. They're arming, preparing for, the next Ukraine, which is maybe themselves, or at least the perspective that it's themselves, whether it's a year from now or 15 years from now. France and Germany really aren't doing that. I mean, they are announcing the right prosumer messaging, but in the end, they're trying to, quote unquote, get things back to some normal. I think the Germans are under a lot of pressure now politically, because they're getting hit from both sides. They're starting to get hit from their own people, or at least a minority of them. And then obviously everything with inflation and everything else, which is much more short-term and tactical. I mean, I'm not saying it's, paying more for bread is not tactical at a daily level, but I'm saying over time, over the next 3 to 5 years, the expectation is you're not going to have 10% inflation every year for the next 5-10 years. So I think the Germans are under this permanent pressure cooker when it comes to the relationship with Russia. And I don't know if there's an easy way out for them, politically, because the population wants things and wants stability and wants certain benefits. And they don't necessarily, those benefits don't involve hundreds of thousands of young volunteer Germans, 18 to 25, joining, the German defense and ultimately NATO, and being deployed in combat power units that are training around the clock and getting hurt. When you train, you get hurt. I mean, you fall down, you break a leg, and things happen, right? And that's real. And the German population and the German political system is not structured now to sell that to their people.
So, now, sort of to pull back to where we were, can you discuss a little bit about how these new membership statuses in the Petersburg Declaration? You're talking about associate membership, associate partners, observers. What was the idea behind creating all these different ways of participating, not entirely participating in the WTO?
Sure. Well, so there was what was called the Kirchberg Declaration in '94, which was, when we say final group, it was sort of the first group, and they called it the final group. So remember, Russia, Soviet Union had ceased to exist, became Russia and the independent states. And those states had their own independent foreign policy. And you also had prior independent states like Turkey, Iceland, Norway, who have always had fairly independent or completely independent of European, common European security or foreign policy or economic, right? They were always more arbitrageurs. And so the objective was to begin this European integration project of basically Central Europe, what now is called really the Visegrad countries. And Germany was really a big proponent of this, actually. So I would argue, at the same time, they were maybe not the greatest actor in the world in Yugoslavia. They were doing fantastic work trying to bring the Baltic states, all the Visegrad states in, and to be honest, to ultimately bring in the Czech, Hungary, and Poland, most importantly. I mean, I would argue Poland is one of the most successful stories in the post-Cold War era in the world. I mean, China gets most of that credit, but when you look at the growth rate of Poland and China in the last 30 years, it's about the same, actually. Poland has been growing. I mean, their economy on their local currency terms is 6 times GDP per capita than it was 30 years ago. So imagine you're a 10-year-old growing up in 1992, and today you're 40 with your family or whatever. You have, is it living in the Netherlands? Yeah, in some cases, yes. But it's definitely, and it's not stopping, right? It's growing, and they have a very, they're fairly well tracked in their economic dimensions and how they're growing. And so I think, to be honest, independent of sort of, let's say their politics recently, but just in terms of them as a growth, as a development story, they really should be the template for most of these states, especially the Balkans coming into the EU or coming into NATO going forward, because they really sort of nailed this, which is to focus on human capital, focus on trade, focus on industrialization, infrastructure, their education system. It's one of the best places in Europe to get something like a dental degree. I mean, it doesn't sound like much, but it's like you can get a great dental degree for the cost of like 2 classes in the US, literally. So it's they've really sort of hacked what it is to be a modern, or they are hacking, I would say, what it is to become a modern European state. And then on a defense basis, they become, I would say, in the East, prior to Ukraine, one of the Eastern European defense superpowers. I think Ukraine is that now. I think this is part of the challenge with Ukraine. Ukraine is going to be basically next to the UK, the most capable military in all of Europe. And I would say one of the biggest advantages the UK still has is nuclear weapons, air forces, advanced Navy, et cetera, which Ukraine doesn't have. But land force wise, I mean, the Ukrainian land forces are as advanced, they're going to be as advanced as anybody in all of Europe's been for, generations. So, and when you mix that with Poland and their modernization, I mean, that's your bedrock of European security in the East, basically. And the rest of those Baltic Nordic countries are jumping on board. So these Visegrad countries are sort of, I don't want to say they're being dragged in, but they kind of are because of geography, right? Because Romania is an exception. I think Romania's made a unique commitment to being NATO defense centric. They're a very uniquely located state, right, on the Black Sea, to the Balkans, and to the south, into Southern Europe, and then also into Central Europe. So, I would say Europe has done a pretty below average job in supporting Romanian development, given how important they are. It would be interesting to see while Ukraine gets redeveloped, if a place like Romania gets that redevelopment, because they really should, given, I believe, the kind of commitment that they want to make in Romania. I guess there was a question here on Poland.
So the question is, let's set the defense budget aside for a second. So is Poland currently a net plus or a net minus in terms of its annual contributions to the European Union? If it isn't today, could it be there in 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, into the EU. I mean, the EU is a little weird when we're talking about measuring that contribution. If I'm measuring a contribution to the EU as a economy, they're absolutely a net plus. If we're saying, because remember, the EU has all these very strange formulaic. I'm not suggesting these things don't make sense when you first build them, but they don't seem to get reset. I mean, very much like in every country, you have lots of weird formulas that made sense when they were first designed, but 30 years later don't make much sense. So Poland operates on a very, let's say, developing country formula. And I would argue they don't really need to be on that anymore. And I actually think it's in their interest not to be in that. That would give them let's say, a more adult seat at the table, even if it meant they had higher contributions. Because you don't get the German manufacturing, the value added, right? The VAT part of it without Poland. Just doesn't happen. So it's one of the big stories of Poland the last really 15 years is they become the same way as, in the last, let's say, 8 years to 10 years, Mexico has become really a manufacturing superpower in the value chain to the United States, especially the let's say the bottom half of the United States. That's really exactly what Poland is to Germany now. And because of this, Poland is now starting to become just a manufacturing hub, period, not just for Germany, but in Europe. So I think that's, and there's no way to, at least this crisis, to see what the Poles are doing in terms of supporting Ukrainians is sort of unprecedented. It's not really talked about because the political dimension of, let's call it the senior side of Polish politics, prime minister, president, the EU kind of issues with legal norms, et cetera. But when you're looking at what they're doing on the ground, I mean, you're talking about 3 million people plus, almost all women and children and elderly, brought in a matter of weeks. I mean, that would literally, imagine like someone dumping another Florida on top of the United States in like 7 weeks or 5 weeks, or your equivalent of it everywhere you are in the world, right? If you're in the UK, imagine just, dumping, Wales on top of the UK, right? Just out of left field. It is pretty remarkable what they've done. And I'm actually sort of disappointed that the European community the EU especially, can't be a little more adult about this part and say, look, we might have our challenges on legal norms and these other conflicts we have, but that's separate, right? What you're, and to be honest, they're not funding this. So, if we're going to really answer your question, I would say you were totally right until February 24th. And now the EU owes Poland, I don't know, pick a number, $100 billion, 100 billion euros, probably more eventually, because they're taking, million plus families on right now, and basically on their own dime. So I think that's something that doesn't really get much mention. And to be honest, the polls, it actually shows they're being adults, I think, maybe a little too much even, that they're not out there pounding that drum, saying, look at what we're doing, we need a check. And not just a check, but we need support, right? The kind of support service to the EU. To be really honest, this is sort of an example. It happened during the migration crisis. I've always had a pet peeve with European crisis response. It's unconscionable to me that the EU has not set up basically humanitarian crisis response center in Warsaw. I mean, period. We're not talking 10,000 people here or a few thousand people, as bad as that would be. We're looking at millions of people here. and it's a border region, right? So, it might be 5 million people going back and forth, and that's not easy. And the EU is sort of just said, oh, well, whatever. This is sort of one of those things that people don't forget this. And I think this is a mistake, and there doesn't seem to be the culture to want to take, and it's a risk. So these things aren't going to all work. There's going to be you're going to bring a lot of your friction out in public. So anyways, I would, if you're on any other events and people, I would always ask those type of questions, because as much as you might not agree with the law and order party of Poland, that, to me, I separate that from clearly what Polish policy is towards Ukraine right now. So the European Security and Defense Identity, the ESDI, another one of these acronyms that doesn't exist anymore, but this was created by, at that point, 16 member states, and the goal was to basically pull to make sure it anchored all of the defense and security structures that the new WEU was constructing, plus what the states were, into NATO. And then this is where they introduced the combined joint task force. And this is where, NATO, if NATO doesn't do something, but WEU can take action or lend its assets. This is where they share or can share infrastructure, satellite, intelligence, logistics, et cetera. To be honest, I think this was a great idea. And if the European security culture could have committed to it and stayed with it, and not every 5 years when there's another crisis kind of create a new set of these, because that's really the challenge with European defense and security, is that whenever there's a crisis, they tend to react, or the states eventually react, or the states react themselves, and then the more common instruments and common collective bodies come together and then create instruments. And the instruments, it's sort of like fixing a problem you used to have. They sort of are designed for the past, not necessarily for what comes forward. And then you're left trying to bend these instruments into the new challenges you have. The next slide, if you don't mind. Yep. All right. So, Treaty of Amsterdam, this was about codification. One of the things that I would say the treaty process did with security is it did construct the codification mechanisms in European security. So you had, going through so many treaties, you did lock together the parties. So, you don't see members attempting to violate the treaty components of their security treaties. Now, what they're smart about is what they don't include in the security or in the treaties themselves. So that's where they tend to have a lot of entrepreneurial space, basically. And they also put in place this mechanism called constructive abstinence, which is a beautifully sounding legalism. It allows a member state to abstain from an operation by just remaining out while not vetoing others. So it allows member states really a third option from either go, no go. And then they chose a high rep, council-like member to be created in order to give a sort of a structure to this. But this has consistently been someone from France or let's say, French supporting, right? I mean, I think we've all seen this, in that Europe tends to break out into these portfolios where, when it's very economic, there tends to be a German or German-ish, and then when it tends to be security and international, it tends to be someone from France. And when the UK was around, they could get a little piece of the foreign and or security piece. They didn't really get much of the economic one, which I always argued that was a mistake. The next slide, real quick here. Thanks. So part of this treaty is including basically everything we just talked about, the whole Petersburg tasks, and to basically harmonize the presidencies of the EU and the WEU. And then don't forget that there was obviously Finland and Sweden are choosing, as we're speaking, to not be neutral states anymore. So maybe that will lead to a question or something you want to bring up, Richard. But we've had these neutral states, Austria, Finland, Sweden, which have always navigated this sort of gray zone in all of the security and defense areas. And the Europeans have always respected that by building, really this almost partition legally, so they can maintain their neutrality.
But
Obviously,
wouldn't you say that there's been a lot of military cooperation even before the Ukraine situation with Sweden and Finland?
Absolutely.
So where do you sort of draw the line between they're being excluded from these sort of organizations at a face-saving level, but not at a functional level?
Well, so what I would say is there's a big difference in the neutrality of Austria versus Finland and Sweden. So Austrian neutrality is, like, if you wanted a Wikipedia entry on neutrality, that would be probably one I would pick, because they have, especially on security defense, they have basically built a non-defense state. They have, I think, about 3,000 members of their reserve, a full-time cadre that trains their reserves. They don't have any reserves, basically. So they're jobs. Now, some of those people get contracted out and go to other organizations. And then they have a very small active duty force. It's really almost a border protection force. Arguably, Austrian defense is very much like Ireland. It really is. In terms of how much they've invested, we're talking, sub percent of a single percentage point of GDP, which has obviously afforded them ability to add several percent of GDP to other programs. And they've been able to, as you would say in economics, rent seek when it comes to their defense and security. Finland and Sweden are different. Finland and Sweden, for all kinds of Cold War reasons, and even pre-Cold War reasons, going back hundreds of years, have had a fairly, I think that's changing as we speak, needed a different security arrangement vis-a-vis not just Russia, but around the other European powers. And so, even though objectively that has changed, the culture hadn't. And one thing Finland and Sweden have done quite a bit, I would say, especially in the last 25 years, it's had a pretty substantial amount of cooperation. They've almost built their own little baby Nordic NATO, which literally has a name. So, there is this security arrangement across the Nordics, with the UK's part of. It's basically this sort of cutout of NATO North, and it acts as its own, which in a strange way, it looks strange on paper, but in reality, if you see how security works in the Mediterranean, right, in the south, big bodies of water, all kinds of actors from the Middle East, Northern Africa, MENA, and then across, everything from Turkey all the way across the Balkans, and to get to Spain and Portugal. We don't think having a special set of security arrangements there is that unique. Well, this is sort of the version of it in the North. I just think a lot of people have these weird cultural biases around Northern European people. They're all nice and neat, well-educated, and all this kind of stuff. And so, it's not a tough, ugly world, but, they are in a pretty difficult backyard. The North Sea, the Baltic Sea, Russia, the climate change, the shift in how the Arctic is going to be developed, and just, everything. And then these sort of legacy security arrangements, right, which gives them a lot of friction, basically. So I think the neutrality of the Northern Europe's a lot different than Austrian neutrality. So next slide, real quick here. All right, the St. Malo Declaration. So this is the 25-year attempt of Europeans to create a European army. That's what I would. I'm oversimplifying, but this is where the goal was to, in essence, instrument European-wide capability, which would be independent of, let's say, NATO, and codependent on individual states. In 25 years, this has failed. I would argue in another 25 years, this will fail. It doesn't make sense with the way modern deterrence works, with the way modern battlefields work, with the way just everything in the modern world is. In a simpler world, a Cold War world, which is still pretty complicated, but in the simpler world, where a land army had, 5 maybe functions, 5 domains of purpose, this probably would have worked. In the modern world, where you have so much sophistication around combining capabilities, it's all really effects and capabilities driven, right? So saying you have a headquarters and an army and uniforms and things like that, that's sort of a oversimplification, like a cartoon. It's really about what are the effects that you want, what are the capabilities you need for those effects, and the sophistication of all of that today is such that attempting to source that from dozens of states to kind of form a purple force, mixing all these different colors together from all the different state flags, just doesn't make any sense.
Does Brexit complicate this impossibility or lessen this impossibility?
I actually think it complicates it even more. I think in some ways the UK gave, it's kind of interesting. So the English have always been against the concept of a European army. I mean, going back like 700,000 years, right? That's a joke. But at a more fundamental level, they are arguably the most completely intensive, committed member of NATO, soup to nuts, right? Everything from the forces, the budgets, even inside their own chaotic politics, they still somehow manage to, pull it off in that commitment. Now, I think other states are really pushing hard now, especially in the East and in the Baltics and in Northern Europe. But they have a lot to catch up with. The UK is a nuclear power. They're at least a regional naval power, and for sure an air power or regional air power. And so they've always been this. They've always seen the development of a European army as being against the development, or at least the reduction in development of NATO. To be honest, I think they were somewhat correct about that, even though my take on this always was let them do it, because when it fails, it'll be the last time they do it. And that's the problem, is it hasn't really failed yet because they haven't been able to even create a battle group functionally. And they're still trying to construct these battle groups that really are about getting a force into Yugoslavia in 1991. I'm being very honest about this. This goes back to our earlier conversation. These battle groups are about solving, not letting Yugoslavia happen. Which, in principle, if there were half a dozen European army battle groups, whatever that would have meant, and you could have deployed them, in each of those states, you probably could have reduced that violence pretty dramatically. And if you had all this kumbaya, great policy, everybody working together, then I think, that might have worked. That didn't exist, doesn't exist, won't exist. But I think that's the thinking behind it. And of course, this really goes to the heart of the conflict between France and the UK, which goes back, to World War II. Basically, it goes back 1,000 years, right? But if we're trying to contain it, it goes back to, the post-Cold War era, in France developing its own completely independent security policy, and then really being, I would argue, the imperial security power of continental Europe, or at least Western Europe, and the UK being an Atlanticist, right? Being a transatlantic power, basically. And that's never been reconciled. It's still not reconciled. I don't, to be honest, see it being reconciled. I think the only way that would have had a chance is if the UK had stayed in the EU and had been granted kind of the co-equal status that it needed to be in the EU, in security and economic dimensions. If that could have happened, then I think over time, over decades, that might have gotten there. But after the UK's out, I just don't ever see that happening again. And France is going to keep building, I would argue, keep attempting to build these battle groups, which are just going to turn into French battle groups. That's literally what this is. It'll be Benelux, France, and a composite of other Western Europeans. It won't even, it'll have, I think over time, it'll have more Italians longer term. I think the only thing I can see that you'd ever use this for is like post peacekeeping and basically UN type operations at that point. Which France does a lot of entrepreneurial UN type operations unilaterally. So, you can make an argument what they're attempting to do is build a parallel or a proxy French expeditionary force that they can leverage when the EU decides there's an expeditionary peacekeeping mission necessary, or some type of security event. So, the whole St. Malo declaration and everything that has been attempted since then has been to, and there's been about half a dozen of these, and we'll go into them in future talks, has been basically attempting to build this concept of a battle group, which is I would argue, these would be standing forces. So it's a little different than NATO, right? NATO is about assignments, you get assigned to NATO or your unit is attached. This is a little different. This would be the construction of a badged European force. Europe's defense maturity can't do this, like collectively. They just can't. They can't do NATO this plus their own domestic forces and anything else they're doing. These special operation type things they do in other places. There's just no way they don't have the breadth to do this. The US is unique because it sounds crazy, but the US can experiment on something with the Marine Corps and then let the Army do the regular stuff, whatever that was, like the prior mission, or some part of the US Air Force or some part of the Navy, because it's just so wide and deep. You don't have that integration across Europe, defense-wise.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned is that France has a significantly larger military than what we see from Germany, or what we see from Poland, or what we see from Italy. So do you see these countries having to increase their defense budgets because they're much closer to the front line, or because there's more of this European sense of integration?
I mean, I can see, so there's two things. We need to be careful when we just measure percentage of GDP as a defense, because you could spend a lot of money on, let's say adjacent defense capabilities, helping build your defense manufacturing base by buying some of the equipment, building a lot of complex bases and sort of fusion centers that cost a lot of money, right? When you put one of these complex centers together that ties everything, intelligence, communications, coordination, et cetera, these aren't cheap. So you can spend a lot of money on those things, which is basically what the Germans are going to do. They're going to be the big managers. They're not going to spend a lot of money on what I would call, expeditionary combat power. What the places they're going to spend that money are going to be in Eastern Europe, the Baltics, and the Nordics. And you're going to see a pretty rapid acceleration there. I would say objectively, most of these places were spending, if they were spending 2%, 1.5% of GDP on defense in the past, I would say most of them were spending maybe 0.1 to 0.2% of GDP on expeditionary and combat power. Most of that being the cost of an air force, because that's expensive. That number I see going up in many cases an order of magnitude. It's going to be pretty substantial. Germany and France are going to make a lot of equipment that, they're going to manufacture a lot that is being bought. I don't see France's development of expeditionary combat power at this point growing much more than it is. Germany will wind up having a lot of shape shifting in this. They'll have a lot of shelled units, but when you get inside of it, how many actual, there's this basic measurement in effectiveness and capability, which is, literally how many people and how much equipment, I mean, there's terms for this, TO&E and so on, but are being used, how many hours a year in training. I mean, it's like it's like flight time, right? That's a number most people are aware of, or somewhat aware of, like how many flight hours does a pilot have? 100 hours a year, 50, 200, 400, whatever, right? Like that's the quantum, basically. Like the best in the world, basically, you're up to somewhere between 200 and 400 hours a year. And anything under 100 starts to be very basic in terms of what you can do in a cockpit, right? And so, and more importantly, coordinating and complex operations. There's a version of that for everything. There's a version of that for naval operations, version of that for land operations, and that's the test. And the Germans right now are one of the lowest in the world. Actually, it's pretty remarkable. They basically don't train much, and especially when you isolate what they do train, right? They train counterterrorism, they train around some peacekeeping and around some let's say peace support operations. Those are important. I'm not suggesting they're not important, but that doesn't help. That doesn't reinforce Poland when it comes to Kaliningrad, and that's the thing we can't forget. Like, look at the backyard Poland's in. Poland's in a tough area, right? I mean, if you look at where the Russian northern military district is, it's the Baltics right into Poland. And if you look at Kaliningrad, it's right there. So, they need a fairly robust set of capabilities to defend basically that whole plain. And that's a plain, basically, which a plain requires a lot more resources, obviously, because it's flat and open, and a lot more layered, complex resources. So, I don't see, actually, I know the German politics are not such that you will see German land army forces in Eastern Poland defending against Kaliningrad and, against the line in Kaliningrad. You will not see that. Politically, no one's going to accept that, either because the optics look so, by historical terms, hideous, and people just aren't psychologically ready for that. So I think those are the kinds of things that are going to be really complicated going forward, because the moment you create all this friction, right, it's either costs you more money to do it or your capabilities go down, right? There's no free lunch, right? So when you create all these, the Germans can't do this, the French won't do this, when you have all this big spreadsheet of what won't happen, well, you need a whole bunch of others that have to step into that. And typically that means the capability is pretty limited, which then means NATO and means really the US and the UK. To be honest, I think the big actor in this that the EU just can't figure out, and I understand, given what's happened in its governance the last 20 years, they won't, at least while Turkey's governed the way it is, but is Turkey. I mean, Turkey's, arguably the largest, outside the United States, and maybe the UK because of nuclear and naval, really the largest army and air force in all of NATO. But Turkey sort of just lives in its own island. Their participation in NATO operations tends to be really limited, especially into Europe. I mean, it's very, it's another one of these, gray zones that nobody talks about.
Right. So, yeah. So I was going to say, is there anything else on St. Malo that we want to talk before we move forward?
I think that's it. We can go forward on this. So, all right. So this is important because a lot of what we've been talking about is, the coupling and decoupling, the duplication, and, these sort of what a discrimination would be against a NATO member, non-NATO member in all of their organization. So, around St. Malo, the goal was to basically not construct anything in going forward European defense and land forces, especially battle groups that were going to decouple from NATO, and as we talked about, that would duplicate, which that gets you, I don't know, this has always been the one that nobody can describe. You can't put the spreadsheet together on this one that makes sense, and that you wouldn't discriminate against NATO members that are not EU members, which they have, obviously. So really, this was really built for everyone but the UK, basically. The next slide, real quick. So this is important because this has been going on since the end of since the end of the Cold War, since the integration of West and East Germany into modern German state, that there's basically been a Berlin Plus arrangement that's been constructed really on a case-by-case basis, but then these stay along for 30 years, 20 years, 10 years. So there's, these types of arrangements like the E3, which is, Germany, France, and Italy. They'll have the E2 plus, which is Germany and France. I mean, these turn into like weird jobs programs. I mean, they're probably pretty good to get if you can get one, because you're just making PowerPoints for a big conference every year, basically, and just reusing ones from other conferences and just, find and replace. But, this is literally the whole point around, this inability of Germany to sort of square itself with its defense and security arrangements, not just in Europe, but in the world. And basically everyone in Europe, sort of acknowledging that and saying, okay, we're going to help you through group therapy, basically. And, this is all about look, there's one aspect of this that I think is actually very useful, which is this does give Germany this ability, and this was very useful in the JOCPA and all kinds of other sort of non-regional instrumentations and actors that were that Germany was involved in. So there is a foreign policy benefit of this that I actually think is actually pretty effective, because it allows Germany to do something outside of the normal European security framework, foreign policy wise, and be a little entrepreneurial but not maybe too much, because they're obviously going to involve other members, almost always France. And they used to sometimes involve the UK, and Italy usually comes along, especially if it involves anything in North Africa, Middle East. You tend to get Italy involved, or the Mediterranean. So these Berlin Plus arrangements, and if you look online, I mean, there are just a lot of these. I didn't include, maybe in the next presentation I'll include them, but I mean, they have a lot of them, dozens of these over the years that they've constructed. It's sort of like, you're not real with Germany unless you get a plus arrangement with them. It's like that allows you to, get invited to the annual party. So what happens, I mean, this is where it gets really strange, because and maybe next time you see this happening, because we have a lot of these meetings this summer, really June, July, the remaining meetings, and then you'll have a bunch in the fall. This is sort of like the supranational security year. You'll see that there's a normal meeting, a NATO summit, or a security summit, and then there'll be this little Berlin Plus meeting, and it's usually right after for like a day. And if you didn't pay attention, you would have just been like, oh, that's just the Germans hanging out longer to have other conversations, which is true. But this is sort of a parallel track they have. So it's a very, I would say, ununiform approach that the rest of Europe accepts and tolerates, because of German power basically in Europe being a third of its GDP basically. There's a question here: does data support EU is more useful, efficient, being bigger, smaller, or currently is the right size in terms of number of member states? It's a good question. I mean, you kind of have like universe inflation going on right now. I mean, you could probably ask the universe this question right after the Big Bang. Is it better at the size it was at, or is it
But I
inflation?
actually think it's the wrong question, and
Yeah.
Because the issues with efficiency in the European Union have much less to do with the number of states that are composing the European Union than the formation of the governance structures within the European
That's right. That's right.
So if you would have a governance structure that was much more streamlined, you would have far fewer issues, despite the fact that you have to have unanimity. Because if
That's
you have
right.
if you have an issue of 15 people versus 35 people, you're not really going to change the unanimity process of basically being zero.
Exactly.
Because you can't get two people to agree on the same proposition.
That's right.
So,
And I mean, you bring up a great point, which is the real question is the democratic deficit in Europe, which leads to this legitimacy deficit, because the inability of people of having a more modern set of federalized political institutions that are more attached to the body politic, even though they have all the instrumentation of it. The only thing they don't have is the people. You know what I mean? It is weird. I mean, it is really strange, actually. It's almost, Roman senatorium, right? I mean, there's a certain, I kind of view like that's what they're thinking sometimes, is that they have a set of elite bodies that know things, and they need to make these important decisions, and they have the allure of a lot of constitutionalism, but they're not actually implementing those. I mean, I just really think at the end, you're either going to make the member of the European Parliament real consequential legislative members that vote up and down policies over time. And you don't have to do it all at once. I mean, you can walk your way in from culture, sport, and entertainment. I mean, I think they can pull that one off all by themselves. I mean, you can walk your way in to all these portfolios over the years, and there would be a much more democratic legitimacy and support, actually, in the EU. To be honest,
no, there's a response in the comments to sort of my argument, which is that wouldn't more members just create more lags and local divergence, just in terms of organizational theory, regardless of the size of your overall, regardless of your overall
organizational structure?
Organizational structure. There's a certain amount of size that's the right size, and I would say yes. But the calibration that it would change is much less. So, I would say it's similar to this situation of the United States functioned better when it was, 15 states as opposed to 50 states. You could make that argument because the 15 states could come to much more consensus under the Constitution, and you passed, 10 amendments right in sequence. I mean, there was clearly a lot more unanimity going on when you had 15 states as opposed to 50 states. But increasing the number from 15 to 50 didn't do that much in terms of harm to the efficiency of the United States. And it's the same in the European Union. The amount of extra states is not the primary issue. The primary issue is all of the different complicated mechanisms by which the European Union is arranged. And those don't work even for 4 states, let alone 28. 27.
And if anything, I think having more states that are more divergent in their development, their history, at the same time, those states are modernizing their politics, modernizing their constitutional structure. So they're newer, they're more novel. I think actually over time that puts more pressure on the EU that they might have more substantial change. If they were the original 6 plus 6, and it was all legacy Western European states, was basically their own club. I mean, they wouldn't change, blinds in 40 years, right? I mean, it's like they just wouldn't change anything. I think having all these newer states, this influx of new blood into the EU, I think actually at a certain point forces these issues up. That's why I think Ukraine will be a big deal, because they're going to, I believe, highlight, and others will too, all of these, incompatibilities that the EU might have, and the EU is going to have to deal with them because there won't just be these new kids on the block, right? It'll be older ones too. I mean, where this gets interesting is at a certain point when you have governments in Hungary and Poland and whatever turn over to more, let's say, moderate or centrist governments, or maybe even center left. but they still have some of the same challenges, and they challenge the EU at that point. What's the EU going to do? Is the EU going to say, like, sign in or you don't get a check? I mean, because that's basically what they do now. And I think that's where this comes to a head this decade. By the end of the decade, you're going to see a substantial push to modernize a lot of the EU itself institutionally. And I believe this will be the moment where either this stays an extra constitutional system, or it becomes an integrated constitutional system at some point. And this goes back to the breakdown in the constitutional development in the EU, basically. Can you go to the next slide? I know we only have about 10 minutes left for this time. So this was the goal originally. So I do want to read this because I think this is speaks to how far away they were from it. I don't know, there was another question here. Oh no, you were responding to that. So back almost 25 years ago, 20 plus years ago, they said by 2003, they want to be able to deploy within 60 days, sustained for at least a year, forces of 50 to 60,000 persons capable of full range of Petersburg tasks. This would be the so-called European Rapid Reaction Force, which, as we know, there's none of this capability. The only capability exists is the NATO Rapid Reaction Force, which is really managed and run out of the UK. And I think that's what gets a little more interesting over time, is those NATO operations being pushed forward into basically a new rapid reaction planning cell being pushed into Eastern Europe, into Poland, basically. I mean, arguably Poland becoming the new UK when it comes to rapid reaction forces. Obviously this failed, and they tried three. We'll go into later how many other times they tried. They made it a little smaller. Instead of 10 of these battle groups, they wanted 3 or 4. Now, if you've looked at the strategic compass that just came out, which we'll review in the future, they want 1 in the next 2 years, 1 5,000 person battle group in the next 2-3 years, which I think they'll find some way to ram a bunch of things together and call it a battle group. But if you ask them when they're going to have their second one, maybe never, 2030. So I've just always felt this is sort of a European delusion. This is a colossal waste of resources that, if they prioritized into NATO and into their own domestic capabilities, they would have far more integrated capability together over the last 20 years. The next slide. Yeah, so
I was going to say, I think this is probably a good part to because the Afghanistan war, we could go on about that for about 30 minutes. Right.
Yeah, so in the next presentation, I'm planning on doing these a little more often, because I know we wound up skipping a few weeks. So right after, as I know we have the 4th coming up in a couple of weeks. So probably right around that, the next 2 to 3 weeks, I plan on having another one. And what I want to cover there is Afghanistan, or basically all the operations that European countries participated in either through NATO, mostly obviously through NATO, and whether it's Afghanistan, whether it was Iraq, and then also the implications of what happened in the Georgian War, and how did Europe respond to that, plus ultimately the treaties all the way through Lisbon, and how did they reflect the development of European defense and security going forward. And then eventually, as we get to now, what I want to do later in the summer, once we're done with that, is go state by state, and how have what's been the history of each state in terms of how did they develop their security, and then how do they operate in 2022, 23, et cetera, especially in this Ukrainian world, that we're in now. So, and if any of you have priorities of different countries because of your backgrounds or whatever, which ones you want first. I mean, I'm planning on going through all of them anyways, but if you want to know, if you have a fancy for history of Austrian security and development, I'm game for that one. I look forward to the Italian one. That's going to be a blast because that's, pretty multidimensional. Obviously the French and the German and ultimately the UK ones, prior to being in the EU and then after, and in the EU and then after the EU. And I have a closet bet that I think they're going to be back into some structure in the next 20 years. I know that sounds like heresy now, but it's my secret bet that I have.
Speaking of structure, do we want to do this on the 17th or on the 24th of July?
Of July, how about the 10th?
You want to do it on the 10th?
Yeah, how about the 10th?
All right.
Yeah,
then.
I'm gonna try to get 2 of these in July. So I'm gonna try, because I know August, for those of you in Europe, you guys are shut down, and so I want to try to get 2 of these in July, maybe one in August early on. If not, try to I want to try to do 2 of these a month, actually, especially as we start getting into the individual states, because those will be a little more tapas like. So, and I'm looking forward to, if you've got, what I want to do is be able to publish those out ahead of time. So those of you who want to do some reading and research, I'm going to try to put some information in there when we get to the individual states, so that you guys can come with, cool questions about why do they do this or why do they do that, and so on. All right. Any other questions? I'm sorry for the
Technical difficulties.
For the cold opening that we had on SNL today, but we'll make sure that that's solved, next time, and we'll be back in the groove. And I hope all of you are, wherever you are, enjoying summer and Sunday, and any Father's Days or any other days that matter to you. So.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, based on our conversation, I've just updated the meetup, so you can find in the meetup exactly where you are, and then if you want to come back and see us again, you know where to find us. So
that's right. And then also, we have the Ukraine next week. We're gonna talk about we'll have a whole robust conversation on that. So we look forward to those of you. We'll get into as many of the weeds that make sense. Our approach to this is we're trying to take a little more medium term, meet every month or 2 on this, because from the outset, we always felt this was going to be more of a long war than it was a short, immediate war. So, but yeah, we definitely look forward to everybody next week. And I know Thursday you have a presentation that I think folds neatly into some of our topics today, even some of the history. So I don't know if you want to give a plug for that.
Yeah, of course. So this Thursday, as part of my Middle Eastern and North African Islamic history series, the Ottoman Empire has its protrusion into the Balkans. And so I wanted to talk about the period between 1878 and 1914 in the Balkans, where you have a number of different, you have 2 numbered Balkan wars, but you also have the struggle for Macedonia, you have Albanian independence, you've got the Grecian invasion of Crete, and then eventually the Enosis in 1906. So you've got a lot of different struggles between the Christian states in the Balkans region, fighting over who will be ascendant. And it's a lot of people to keep track of, a lot of countries to keep track of, but it's an incredibly volatile and interesting time, and hugely influential going up into World War I, which we will then cover for the following 2 weeks. The first week, all the Ottoman campaigns and Balkan campaigns in World War I. And then the second time, we're going to go within the Ottoman Empire and discuss the Armenian, Assyrian, and Pontic Greek genocides, along with other internal issues the Ottoman Empire had during the war.
And this one is what number in the series? Just want to get that right.
41 this upcoming
Yes.
week. We have been doing this ever since July of 2021. I've been going basically every week. Yeah.
I think it's one of the longest focused series on Earth right now. Seriously.
Yeah, it's up there with those podcasts where they do like every day in World War One.
Yeah, exactly. But those guys, I don't know if those guys have a job actually. But
True.
No, so it's really great, and so I really recommend everybody if you get a chance. And then obviously all of these are on YouTube, so you can go back and listen to prior ones.
Exactly.
The whole series from Richard is fantastic, actually. So.
Yeah, if you got a spare 80 hours to kill,
It's the summer. Everyone's got a spare 80 hours somewhere. So, anyways, enjoy your spare 80 hours, everybody. Look forward to seeing you next
time you join us.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much.
And as I said, everything is already up on Meetup, so you can find in whatever Meetup group you're in, the Ukraine event, the European Union events, all of my Middle Eastern series, and a number of other things that we put together, such as our live reenactment, which will probably happen in July as well, of Roman soldiers. Sergio's coordinating that, which is going to be fantastic.
Yes, that'll be great. That'll absolutely be great.
So anyway, pleasure to see everybody. And
absolutely.
We'll sign off.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard.